Users are primarily end users and financial intermediaries, and we see a lot of this activity concentrated in the developed markets of the United States and the UK. To be sure, derivatives represent a very effective and a lot of times very inexpensive way to hedge risk if used appropriately and with the proper risk management systems. In the previous session next door, I heard the Cambodian government is actually hedging against rising interest rate risk by purchasing interest rate swaps from the ADB. And they've changed their fixed rate floating ADB loans into fixed rate ADB loans. So I think today we're going to start looking and examining at maybe a little tougher topic, which is how to develop or developing a locally based derivatives market. This is a request that Jonathan and I have been receiving, not surprisingly, more often since we went into a rising interest rate cycle. There's a number of prerequisites. I think we'll cover some of them. If you look at your program, we've identified derivatives law, changing related taxation, and reviewing the financial infrastructure as possible prerequisites. I'd like to add a few. Yesterday when I spoke on benchmarks, I talked a bit about the development pyramid, the financial sector development pyramid. And in that pyramid, money markets are at the bottom. They're the absolute fundamental building block of any capital market, followed by the government debt market, and only at the top and at the end do you get the derivatives markets and your structured finance. You need to be sure that the markets are deep and liquid. If you're going to, at this time, be worried about rising interest rate risk, and a lot of your banks are asking to hedge locally, who will their counterparties be? If you're in a rising rate environment and you want to hedge, by default, the other side of the transaction is a speculation or something. So who in your market is going to take that side? So with that open question, let me turn this over to our first speaker, Mr. Vijay Chander from ASIPMA.
Yes, thanks, Sam, for the introduction. Yes, I think despite all the bad press that derivatives have got recently, there's certainly a number of benefits. But before I start, certainly I'd like to thank my old friends at the ADB and also the Ministry of Finance, Kingdom of Thailand, Public Debt Management Office to give me this opportunity. Right, so moving on to the very first transparency, what are some of the benefits of derivatives? Again, my presentation will be focused on some of the bigger picture issues around derivatives. While I have been a market participant in the last 5 or 6 years of SIFMA, I've been involved more on the advocacy side, so of course dealing more with derivatives regulation and so on. In terms of the benefits, there are certainly a huge number of economic benefits that derivatives provide, including of course the most important function of giving some idea of future prices, which would then enable those who are taking risk to hedge those risks. And we have certainly heard of examples of everyone from governments to corporates to banks to a number of buy-side funds and so on, who all use derivatives to hedge risks. And over-the-counter derivatives, which can be tailor-made to meet individual requirements, whether that be the requirement of a fund who's looking at locking in returns for a bunch of retirees, or a corporate trying to hedge foreign exchange risk, can get tailor-made products via the OTC derivatives market. And in fact, governments too can benefit from tailor-made solutions. So clearly, derivatives play a role across the board in virtually every industry, financial services, mortgages, trade finance, and so on. So clearly, I think the case for derivatives cannot be overstated. Despite their scope for misuse, they certainly have several good uses to which they can be put. Moving on, let's look at some of the Asian derivatives volumes. They've actually been going up quite impressively. I mean, over the last 10-year period, there's been a 67% cumulative growth with interest rate derivatives and FX, roughly similar percentages, around 5 to 6%. But however, the interesting thing is, as a proportion of total global volumes, Asia is very small, only around 10% of global turnover in interest rate derivatives, while FX is a bit more, 26%. Again, that's not too surprising. Asia has a number of countries. CNY off late, that's the Chinese renminbi, has become progressively more important. So that might account for higher FX derivatives turnover more recently, while it's still relatively small in global terms. So there's clearly considerable room for growth. Looking at some of the, in terms of the composition of the markets, we do have some figures for interest rate derivatives turnover. That's around 60% of the last decade, but swaps account for the bulk of interest rate derivatives turnover. It's about 82%. It's that big bar in the center, while options and other products, including forward rate agreements, account for the rest. So again, considerable growth, but swaps dominate, and for good reason, because that is a very commonly used derivative, and US dollar interest rate swaps are in fact amongst the most traded instruments globally. And to the extent that a number of countries in Asia are in fact dollar linked, either de facto or de jure, that would account for the dominance of swaps. Moving on to foreign exchange, the picture is a bit more diversified there. Again, impressive growth, around a 70% growth in FX turnover, but swaps and spot FX account for 54% and 26%. So swaps clearly not as dominant in the case of foreign exchange as it is for interest rates. And of course you have longer dated cross-currency ERCAs, outright forwards and FX options, which also have a substantial chunk of the market. So it's a bit more diversified. Again, not too surprising, a number of currencies in Asia. FX is, I think, intuitively also a bit easier to understand. And in fact, there are quite a few more transactions involving FX that take place on a daily basis. So there's a lot more familiarity with that product. Again, if you look at it, look at the growth in turnover in a more granular fashion, it's very much a mixed bag. I mean, certainly Australia, China, Hong Kong have seen growth. Again, we're talking only about interest rate derivatives, while Chinese Taipei, India, Indonesia, and Japan have seen a fall. Malaysia also down around 10%, again, over the last 9-year period. The reasons for this are manifold. I mean, there's a mix of currency controls, changes in policy, all of that, which can account for some of these changes. Again, offshore centers will tend to do a bit better than onshore centers. China is certainly more impressive. It's very much an onshore market, but the CNY, whether it's the bond market or indeed the FX market, has just grown by leaps and bounds. And certainly the inclusion of the renminbi in the special drawing rights basket has helped support Chinese growth, because more and more central banks progressively will be using CNY in some way, shape or form. Looking at foreign exchange, the growth in FX has been a bit more consistent than interest rate derivatives. Again, but for Australia, and where even the figure is actually relatively small, all other countries have generally shown a lot of growth. Again, it's worth noting Australia, the Australian dollar has been a widely traded international currency which has been used for some time, so there will be some fluctuations year over year. But the other countries, certainly the EM countries, the emerging markets in Asia, have all shown reasonable growth. Certainly the internationalization of the renminbi that I've alluded to will continue. So China will, I think, in the fullness of time, probably dominate Asia, although Japan and Hong Kong are in fact very important, Singapore as well, by virtue of the fact that they are international financial centers. So there will be a lot of third currency trading in these countries, which will ensure their dominance for quite a while yet. Now, post the global financial crisis, and again in response to the criticism of derivatives, there has been a lot of changes in the way regulators want to look at derivatives. They want to regulate derivatives, and there are worries around systemic instability. So the Financial Standards Board was tasked with developing a framework that would tend to move or that would drive derivatives to centrally traded venues, such as exchange-traded derivatives, or allow standardized OTC instruments to be centrally cleared. Again, the reason for that is simply that, look, the regulators would like to have a better view of what's actually going on in the markets. And for that reason, non-centrally cleared OTC derivatives would be subject to higher margin requirements. Again, in terms of taking the lead, the more developed markets in Asia, such as Hong Kong, Singapore, Japan, and Australia, have decided to implement most of the G20 proposals, while China, India, and Korea have focused more on central clearing and the establishment of trade repositories. Some of the smaller markets, though, have not made too many strides. Again, it could well be that the markets, the derivatives markets, are relatively smaller here. What are some of the issues and challenges in Asia? There are significant legal uncertainties. I mean, the weak contractual enforceability, the less developed OTC derivatives markets. The other big issue that we are grappling with, certainly at ISIFMA, is the fragmentation of Asian central counterparties. If each country wants to move derivatives trading to its own CCP, it leads to fragmentation. That's not necessarily the most efficient solution. We want some competition so that trading does get centralized in more venues. Also, if the more venues there are, the more the uncertainties around regulatory equivalence. You need to be classified as DCO exempt if it's a CFTC that regulates the venue, or under EMIR, which is the European legislation, you need something called equivalence. And not all venues have obtained this, and that is very much a challenge, certainly in the Asian context, particularly on the subject of significant recommendations then, as we move towards we get closer to the end of the presentation, address legal and contractual uncertainties around contractual enforceability, particularly close out netting and collateral rights. I mean, what happens when collateral is trapped and you can't get a hold of it? And again, the more developed jurisdictions, there are clear waterfalls that determine who gets the collateral and who doesn't, but we need to focus on that in Asia. Netting enforceability issues, but markets in particular, China, Indonesia, very big markets, India as well, Malaysia and Vietnam need to be resolved satisfactorily. Again, you need to allow counterparts to deal on a gross rather than net basis. Gross basis posting, gross collateral, extremely inefficient. Tying up margin, tying up funds when they could be put to better use. Again, US and the EU, they're just getting almost out of control with respect to extraterritoriality. MiFID II is a big issue from Europe, so there are issues there. The CFTC looks for DCO exemptions across the board, and again, they're not very liberal in granting these exemptions. CCIL in India, for example, is yet to receive DCO exemption. Again, Pan-Asian clearing solutions, I think, is a good solution to prevent fragmentation, and refrain from imposing initial margin requirements. Some of these are really very technical, and need to refer to Basel III and the credit value adjustment charges. Again, they need to be rationalized. So mandatory variation margining and standardized liquid or OTC derivatives clearing would be very, very helpful. The next transparency is relatively not that easy on the eye, I'm afraid, but then it does tell you how the FX derivatives margin regime varies across jurisdictions, starting with the developed ones on top, EU, US prudential rules, and the US CFTC rules. There are timing issues of T+1, T+2, T+3, when collateral has to be settled, and in terms of how they deal with non-netting jurisdictions. That's pretty important too, because in some cases they will collect gross from a non-netting jurisdiction, but then post-net, which is the US CFTC rules. That's really unfavorable to the jurisdiction that's non-netting, right? Because one jurisdiction is posting gross, a large amount of margin, but they cannot collect very much in return. So there are all these issues. Again, Australia, Japan, Singapore, Hong Kong, for the most part, have exemptions in dealing with non-netting jurisdictions, so that's very good. India, we are looking for some guidance in the draft rules. And in the case of Korea, they have their own unique rules. There's no exchange initial margin, but there is a requirement that you properly manage risks and so on. So there are lots of technical issues here, and this is where the regime stands in various countries. The next slide is a tad more important because it deals with the status of central clearing houses, and in terms of where each of these clearing houses stands with respect to recognition either from Europe or the United States, or both, in both instances. So Australia, of course, developed jurisdiction, is recognized and is DCO exempt. So the areas shaded in red are where the most worries are focused. And they're clearly the Shanghai Clearinghouse for China, which is the central clearinghouse for renminbi derivatives. So they did have safe harbor from the CFTC for a brief period of time. That's expired in February, so they're in a bit of limbo. And India, interestingly enough, is one of the countries that's recognized by EMIR. The Europeans have recognized India, but the US hasn't. And again, there are different rules in terms of what products are cleared in each of these relative exchanges. So getting equivalence from the US and Europe will be very important for Asia, I think. And I finally have to acknowledge the folks who helped me out with the presentation. So our sister organizations, GFMA, we're very pleased to have CEO of GFMA here, Mark, been very helpful. And ISDA, BIS, and KPMG have also helped us out. Thank you very much.
Could I maybe just insert a quick question before we move on? You mentioned equivalence, and of course I understand what that means. But if you were a local jurisdiction and you either had a derivatives market, a fledgling derivative market, or were thinking about a CCP, and you didn't have equivalence, what in layman's terms does that actually mean?
It's not critical if you don't impose either a central clearing requirement or a central trading requirement. The moment you impose that, though, then the intermediary of the country that's giving you equivalence cannot trade on that exchange. So let's say you're Citibank, and I'm just making this up, you want to trade Kyat in Myanmar, and you have a Kyat central clearing requirement in the Yangon Central Clearinghouse. That would be a problem for Citibank to use.
Right.
So
Because
that's
it's not.
in this case it would be a DCO exemption. Equivalence is more a European construct. So EMIR, which is the European Market Infrastructure Regulation, I think that's what it stands for, will have to allow, or will have to say that, look, Myanmar has been found equivalent to European exchanges. Now there's a process for doing that. Myanmar can submit certain forms that they fill in, the Europeans look at it, and then grant it.
So I think, thanks for that answer, because the point I'm trying to make is that to have a local derivatives market, you need to have diversity of business model or outlook, if you will. And so if you have a central clearing and it doesn't have, I'll use equivalence just to be simple, you're not going to get foreign participation, essentially.
Yeah. The intermediaries of that jurisdiction can't trade on your exchange. So in some cases the Americans can trade, but the Europeans can't, in some cases the other way around. Oh, they can incorporate locally, yes. They can create a local sub, absolutely. Well, that creates other problems. I'm not suggesting that they do that, but I'm giving you a legally correct answer.
Okay, thank you. Who's next?
Please.
Good afternoon, everybody. Let me get as close to the mic as possible because I know they haven't been working that great. So, Steve started off with the Warren Buffett quote. That quote actually comes from 2002, 5 years before the financial crisis. So very prescient words. And of course the financial crisis unleashed huge losses, estimated at about $15 trillion US, largely as a consequence of excesses in the credit default swaps market. So I think we can concede that Mr. Buffett has got a point. Now the regulatory response to the GFC, at the 2009 Pittsburgh meeting of the G20, stated that we have enhanced and expanded the scope of regulation and oversight with tougher regulation of over-the-counter derivatives, securitization markets, credit rating agencies, and hedge funds. And as Vijay's already gone on to say, in the USA, the implementing measures included the Dodd-Frank Act and the rules implemented by the CFTC, whilst in Europe, the European Market for Infrastructure Regulation of 2012 became the cornerstone regulation. So I'm also going to talk a little bit about data, but I've only got one slide on data, so I won't duplicate everything that Vijay has already taken you through. But to provide context for the work required, we can observe that OTC derivatives vastly outweigh exchange-traded derivatives, at least by volume. However, as a direct consequence of the regulatory process, all OTC trades executed in the USA and the EU are now reported through trade repositories and largely cleared through CCPs. Each counterparty has its own legal entity identifier, and each trade has its own unique transaction identifier. Therefore, clearing, reconciliation, and audit trail have been established. This was really what the regulators were aiming for. But as is so often the case, there are unforeseen consequences. European Central Bank Executive Board member Yves Mersch captured this in a nutshell in a speech just 2 weeks ago when he said that CCPs can only make the financial markets safer if they are safe themselves. Hence, in the EU, EMIR is now being supplemented and reinforced by the development of the Recovery and Resolution of CCP rules. This BIS source data that I'm showing you also informs us that interest rate derivatives dominate OTC markets, with 80% of outstanding notionals and an even more dominant position for exchange-traded derivatives. Foreign exchange does get a look in the OTC market, I suspect largely due to the widespread and practical use of cross-currency swaps and FX options, but it pales into insignificance in exchange-traded markets. No doubt the bespoke and flexible nature of OTC instruments provided a few jurisdictions where netting is not possible yet, although obviously this is not a comprehensive list because many of the countries which are represented in this forum this week are not appearing on this page. I do think it's important to acknowledge that recognition by ISDA as a clean netting environment is key to the development of an efficient derivatives market. The ability to execute cross-currency swaps in these countries and currencies under a global ISDA umbrella will have a significant impact on the financing of long-term infrastructure projects in local currency, not only for ADB and our sister multilaterals, but also on the broader universe of banks and investors. Now I'm going to turn to 3 case studies. The first, fittingly, is here in Thailand, where ADB transacts in the cross-currency swap market to source Thai baht for our onshore loan operations. This project was for the construction of Nam Nyep 2, a dam and hydroelectric power plant, which is actually located in neighbouring Lao PDR. ADB was able to source 22-year door-to-door amortizing swaps to finance the corresponding infrastructure loan on a bespoke basis. And this is not a one-off. We completed 3 such swaps in 2016 and 4 more last year. I'm a little bit humbled when I listened yesterday to the presentation from the Thailand PDM, and they described 15 to 20-year exposures as medium term. For us in our local currency markets, this is really ultra long. But I know in Thailand, ultra long means 50 years. That's a takeaway for me. Almost as important as the long tenor, ADB can count on a panel of about half a dozen counterparties in Bangkok, which supports pricing tension. This means that the gap between the winning bid and the second place is regularly less than a basis point. Think of that on a 22-year swap. What is also interesting in this case is that the physical project is actually located outside of Thailand, implying that the Thai baht would be used offshore That's often a no-no for central banks, and BOT is no exception. However, since both the project procurement and the eventual power offtake to EGAT were secured within Thailand, approval for the use of funds offshore was obtained from Bank of Thailand. My case study number 2 zooms in on ADB's use of interest rate derivatives to manage ALM gaps in Indian rupees. Now, over the last 2 years, ADB has raised nearly $1 billion of funding from the offshore INR linker bond market, also known as the Masala bond market. Last year, we even launched ADB's first green bond in local currency, a 5 billion rupee 3 3/4 year trade. For this case, the maturity of the liability, i.e. the Masala bond, at 3 3/4 years, was longer than that of the asset, or the loan, at 3 years, so we needed to manage the ALM gap. To manage fixed rate liabilities over such a long term is obviously challenging, so we contracted forward start interest rate swaps to convert our reflows into floating rate obligations. This forward start IRS is priced against compounding overnight index swap, a highly liquid benchmark in India, thank you to FBIL, allowing ADB to invest our floating rate reflows into bank deposits or T-bills with a positive carry until the maturity of the liability or Masala bond. This is now our go-to solution for managing fixed rate liabilities in Asian local currencies, and we aim to adopt the same approach in the Philippines and Indonesia for similar exercises in the near future. My final case study, I confess, is more of a pitch, and this is directed at all our participants from PDMOs. I would like to just simply inform you that ADB offers sovereign borrowers the opportunity to hedge interest rates and currencies with ADB on your third-party liabilities. You already know that you can elect for a currency or interest rate conversion on your ADB loans, but here ADB Treasury is offering standalone currency or interest rate hedging against your loans contracted from other sources. Perhaps you are able to manage your currency or interest rate exposures yourselves directly, but there may be unquantified costs to those exercises, particularly under XVA. Whereas from ADB, we will offer transparent pass-through pricing for a 5 basis point annual fee on interest rates and a 12.5 basis point annual fee on currency conversions. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for your kind attention. I'll leave you with our contact details.
Just one quick point, just to reconcile the notion of India not being a clean netting jurisdiction. It's worth mentioning. It's not as though the folks in India are not aware of this issue. It's very much there. It's almost a reality that we will have closeout netting. It's just that it's being held hostage by the Financial Resolution and Deposit Insurance Bill that contains references to closeout netting that hasn't been passed in Parliament. So FRDI bill is holding this up. But otherwise India is a clean netting jurisdiction. Thank you.
This one? Yeah.
So, Jonathan, can I get a few questions in before we move on?
You might want it.
Yes.
You can ask the question first. Yeah, of course.
We've talked a lot about netting, as if everybody understands.
Yes.
So I think maybe we take a short break and kind of explain how simple the concept is, but how big the ramifications are if you don't have it.
Okay. So when we have clean netting, it is an immediate enabler to contract with global counterparties in pretty much any jurisdiction, because as long as they're operating under a branch and we can contract under a global ISDA and CSA. This is enormously important because when we cannot do that, we need to document a standalone ISDA CSA with that counterparty, which takes a lot of time and energy and is quite contentious. And also we have to look at how that counterparty is ring-fenced from the global pool. So that's the documentation side of it, but in terms of the impact, I mean, China, I think, is the best example of an Asian jurisdiction where we don't have clean netting, and that's because the China enterprise bankruptcy law doesn't allow for this. And so literally an administrator can go on and say, well, this obligation is included, this one is not. It's the cherry-picking concept. And therefore, anybody who's contracting in that market will look at their exposure on a gross basis and not on a net basis.
Yeah, sure. I mean, to make it even more simple, look, I mean, if you're a bank and you go bankrupt, in the absence of netting, the administrator can just choose all the contracts in which your mark-to-market is favorable to yourself, i.e. the bank going bankrupt, and say, look, everybody pays them off first, and those where you have a loss, you don't pay, and that's resolved later. So, but if you had netting, you wouldn't have to worry about that, would you? Yeah. So I suppose that makes it very simple, really. Yeah.
So I'll go even simpler. Jonathan owes me 10, I owe Jonathan 8. So in netting, if we have netting, Jonathan owes me 2.
Exactly.
And that's what I have to have capital for, and that's what I risk manage for. Otherwise, Jonathan owes me 10.
That's right. Perfect. Even better.
With your permission, I prefer to stand up. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank ADB and Ministry of Finance of Thailand for this excellent organization of this wonderful event. It was always puzzling for me why ADB was choosing these kind of beautiful spots on this earth to organize these kind of events. But progress in terms of derivative market development, what we have achieved so far, where are we and where are we going in the future. So I'm not sure if I have to explain the importance of derivatives market, but let's again say that for the once the financial markets are getting bigger, the fluctuation of the prices, interest rate, exchange rates, it's very important. And for management of these risks of fluctuation, it is absolutely important to have derivatives instruments. In Georgia, derivatives market is not that developed yet, but there is increasing demand in derivatives instruments. And there are two major factors which cause this increase of demand. The first is the floating exchange rate, and the second is floating rate loans and securities. So since we have demand on the instruments, NBG, who is the leading party in this development of the market, came up with the plan of the development of derivatives market. And there are three pillars in this project. They're equally important. Maybe some of them requires more or less time, but like in terms of importance, all of them are extremely helpful and useful and must have. The first stage, which my presentation is basically dedicated, is create the sound legal environment for derivatives, and previous speakers already highlighted the importance of netting, closeout netting, as well as existence of financial collateral, which I will touch upon in my presentation. The next pillar is refinement of business infrastructure, because without proper infrastructure and IT infrastructure in place, it is hard to imagine like well and smoothly running derivatives market in Georgia and elsewhere as well. And the last but not least, it's like capacity building activities. So without knowledge, without the most important things nowadays, information, you cannot deal with these instruments. And as it was said, if you don't know what you're dealing with, yes, this might be a mass destruction weapon. But if you use derivatives wisely, it will be beneficial for everyone. So as I mentioned, we drafted the law on derivatives, netting, and financial collateral. the draft legislation addressed these three main issues: derivatives, netting, and financial collateral. Derivatives, as I already said, is important for hedging the fluctuation of interest rates and exchange rates. Also, having a sound law and proper law of derivatives, it is important to help cross-border derivatives transactions in Georgia, because major banks always were mentioning that to have less expensive and more cross-border transactions, it is absolutely imperative to have netting and derivatives legislation in place. We're working on that, and we hope that this draft law soon becomes the actual legislation, and the derivatives market will develop more. Netting helps to reduce the credit risk, as well as capital requirements, and there are important certain legal protections that already said in case of insolvency that the insolvency administrator or any other equivalent authority could not intervene and make invalid the netting, the payments conducted through netting, via netting, and the finality of netting provisions are also important, and the irrevocability of the orders which is made through netting agreements are also essential. The next thing is financial collateral, which is quite different type of security. When Georgia adopted financial collateral, we were based basically on the Financial Collateral Directive, which is part of the EU legislation. The most important characteristics of financial collateral is first that it gives the priority, which is essential to any security. So if you hold the financial collateral, there is no issue of priority ranking or who will get satisfied, who is the second, who is third. You have the priority right, and you are the first one who will receive this collateral. Under Georgia legislation, as well as under directive, financial collateral can be either cash, gives the right of collateral taker, providing that there is the agreement on this, to use the financial collateral in other transactions. But when it comes to time to return the financial collateral, at that time it should possess not the same collateral, but equivalent collateral. And on the definition, what is equivalent, parties agree in advance in their contractual agreement. So these are the on a high level, the issues that our draft legislation covers, but I will try to go in more details. But before I move to the details, I just want to highlight how important it is to include all the stakeholders in the process of drafting of legislation, because it's not only for National Bank to decide or Ministry of Finance, but there are several agencies or ministries that you have to convince them to have such legislation in place, and they should know this pretty well, because one thing you have legislation, but another thing is like when you judiciary, courts or arbitrators test the provisions, how they interpret the law. One thing you have with the provisions, another thing judges and arbitrators do not understand what they are dealing with. So it's important, and it's part of the capacity building activities, to actively involve with all stakeholders, but mainly to prioritize and work with judiciaries, judges, to give some information how things work in practice and what's the best practice, best international practice in this regard. So, main objective of this draft law are as following. The first, the definition of derivatives in legislation, as well as generic definition, quite broad definition of derivative, and other more specific definitions like swaps, options, forwards, like specific instruments of derivatives. The second important point is to ensure enforceability of derivatives, and I will touch upon why and what kind of risks enforceability of derivatives pose in the absence of proper legislation. Finality of netting and closeout netting, and refinement of existing legal provisions for financial collateral. I mentioned the refinement because Georgia already has provisions for financial collateral, but we had some certain problems in legislation which we're about to solve by this draft law. Next is ensuring enforceability of derivatives. There are certain risks, according to international practice, that derivatives might, in some cases, recharacterized as gambling or insurance, which definitely derivative is not. So we put in place separate wordings and provisions in other legislation, Civil Code of Georgia, Insurance Law of Georgia, that derivative is not gambling and it's not insurance. It might have a similar effect, but absolutely different instrument. Netting and close-out netting. So why netting is important? Previous speakers already highlighted this issue, but what happens if we don't have netting? So we're saying that in case of netting, there is the net liability, net amount, which is quite small compared to the actual claims of the parties to each other. So in case of absence of the netting, the one party has to pay to another and wait until the other party pays him. Because in case of close-out netting, which is important, when you calculate the net value, you calculate not the present value, but also sometimes it's called acceleration, future claims that you might have to the parties. So all the claims and liabilities are pooled in one place and calculated at the moment when close-out netting is triggered. This is in case of default, and most of the times default is insolvency or similar event which is agreed by the parties. So in this case, you shouldn't wait for the other party, and you either have net liability or net claim to your counterparty. What happens to the net value? So net value generally is secured by financial collateral, not like ordinary collateral, because as I said, financial collateral also provides protection in case of insolvency. So insolvency administrator or equivalent state body, even court, cannot intervene and say that no, this collateral belongs to other person, you should not entitled to take it. Because there is a specific legal provision which protects this, and unless of course it's not like we don't have the case of bad faith and abuse of right or something like generally which is against public policy of the country. In ordinary cases, if there is an enforceable collateral arrangement, the net value can be collateralized and the party can be secured that the net value will be also compensated. So we had netting provisions in Georgia legislation, but we refined and improved certain provisions. We had netting only in case of payment system providers and payment system participants. Now we enable netting to any party, providing that they have the transactions concluded on qualified financial contracts. So subject matter will limit the parties as well at the end of the day. Before, only in case of close-out netting was available only in case of financial collateral. Now we enable netting in case of financial collateral arrangement as well as in the absence of financial collateral arrangement. Enforceability safeguards, we imply the same, that we protect from the intervention of the courts, insolvency administrators, liquidators, and other equivalent bodies to invalidate such agreements. Excluding risk of recharacterization, in some jurisdictions, paying net amount was discussed as the penalty. And in majority of jurisdictions, judges can reduce the amount of the penalty, which is totally unacceptable in financial markets. So we make the specific provision which said that net amount calculating through netting provisions should not be constituted as a penalty. And judges and courts should not have right to reduce the amount calculated. And financial collaterals, we currently in draft we have two types of financial collaterals: title transfer and secured financial collateral. We gave the parties right provision which enables them to use financial collateral. We extended the scope of the financial collaterals to ordinary legal entities, but only in case if the other party is commercial bank or sophisticated financial institution. And we reinforced the enforceability of financial collateral and protection, not only in case of insolvency, but interim measures by the court cannot be used on the financial collateral, the subject matter of the financial collateral. So this is the highest protection of the collateral that you may ever have. And this, everything is in line with best international practice, as I said. The last but not least, the most important thing is taxation of derivatives. How tax code of Georgia will treat derivatives. So this is nothing new. We again adopted the best practice in that regard. For me, it's not simple, but the principle is simple. Taxation will be in accordance with IFRS standards, and any loss or profit, any profit which is established by IFRS standards is taxable for tax purposes. Any loss will be deducted. So even unrealized gain and even unrealized profit will be taxed. And in case of collateral, receiver collateral will be taxed on the profit which it will receive from the use of the collateral, and collateral giver will be taxed on the income which it receives from the collateral. So these two slides are about the statistics, how basically in Georgia derivatives market there are only FX forwards, and this is the amount of the transactions concluded in Georgia, and on this slide there is the number of transactions concluded last year and the first quarter of 2018. And as a summary, what is our ultimate and final objectives after having the legislation in place? We intend to obtain ISDA legal opinion, I'll put it publicly, from ISDA, which will, we expect, boost the development of cross-border transactions in Georgia, derivatives transactions in Georgia. And we want to develop ISDA-type local master Georgian version of master agreement, which will also help to promote local transactions on Georgian derivatives market. I think I have time. Thank you for your attention. I'm ready to answer your questions. Thank you.
It's a question for Georgian colleague. Very interesting, you said that even unrealized gains would be taxed. Unrealized losses would be deductible. We're thinking about an issuer who's basically hedging the proceeds of its issuance. At the end of the year, whatever, the bond is marked to market, the derivative is marked to market. You just explained that in derivative, if there is a profit, it is being taxed. On the bond, there might be a mark to market. Most likely, if you have a profit, most likely, not always, but most likely, if you have a profit on derivative, you would have a loss, unrealized loss on the bond. Would that be deductible?
I think no.
That's an issue. You understand that's an issue.
Yes.
We got the response over here. We want to.
No, yeah, there will be no deduction. In fact,
We can't hear you because you don't speak very loud.
So we have considered that case when working on the law of this taxation issue. Obviously, if a derivative is used for hedging purposes,
So obviously if derivative is used for hedging purposes, so that then your point is exactly right, you should take both positions into consideration, probably to be fair. But at this stage we thought that it may be premature or will be difficult to make the distinction of derivatives positions, whether they are used for hedging or not, in our market, and for tax regulators it would be difficult. So we thought that we skip that moment for the time being, but we will come back to that at a later stage when the market develops, but that's an important point.
Okay, thank you for the response. I have an additional question, if I may. Why didn't you consider just not taxing unrealized losses and gains and only taxing them when they are realized?
I mean, that's an interesting question. What we adopted here, to be frank, it's what was the recommendation of IFIs and what they told what was the best practice. But the general practice is like when you use for hedging purposes, you're not taxed. But as Georgie mentioned, because in Georgian market, for even Ministry of Finance, it's not easy to identify and characterize which one is hedging and which one is for speculation. We did not avoid that issue. We just said that minister has the authority to designate a special treatment in ad hoc basis to certain types of transactions and regulate differently. So in case if there is no specific reference in legislation that for hedging purposes it should not be taxed and should be used different kind of treatment, but in that case what you had mentioned, the Minister of Finance has the authority under the tax code to designate different kind of treatments to the taxation of this kind of instruments. And maybe we implied there like derivatives conducted for hedging purposes.
Actually,
so there is a flexibility in legislation.
Yeah, because you mentioned that it's difficult to identify those who are for hedging purposes and those for, as you say, speculation. I would like to use not for hedging purposes.
Sorry.
Because trading derivatives is not a bad thing, whatever Buffett is saying, in most cases. But perhaps you could also adopt accounting standards. Because there are accounting standards out there under IFRS
Yes.
and also under US GAAP, where issuers can actually designate derivatives used for hedging purposes. And then that has a specific accounting treatment as well as bond issuance that's linked to the derivative. So in other words, you don't even need to identify them yourself. The accounting standards do that for you.
True. Well, the issue of legislations we will use is for ad hoc basis. There is an instrument which makes that happen, and particularly if IFRS has that internal tools to make that happen, to make this distinction between those two, then I don't see the problem of doing that and that not happening.
Thank you.
Would you like to add something on that?
You want the microphone?
Of your loan products, and so countries can obviously take that up, fixed floating and so on. Now I'm assuming that as a result this is a changing in the loan agreement and therefore is not seen as a derivative. And you were mentioning about Cambodia, because I would imagine a number of the countries do not have the regulations in place to be able to enter into swaps or the instruments that you provide. So you said you also have the ability to enable them for other non-ADB loans to do that. So can you just clarify how ADB treats the countries and what regulations or requirements do they have to have in place before you can enter in that? Because we don't want to have a Hammersmith and Fulham, which you presumably are well aware of, that caused enormous problems in the UK.
Okay. So what we've developed in ADB is, I suppose we could call it, it's a derivative framework agreement. So it's somewhat like an ISDA, and it's based upon an ISDA derivatives framework agreement. We are not asking any of our counterparties to change their national legislation in any way in order to accommodate that, because they're dealing with us as a multilat. Okay. So, yeah, so there's usually multi-lets are excused from those kind of situations.
I assume that's how Cambodia were able to do their...
I think Cambodia did it all actually on their loan from ADB though. That wasn't a third party liability, it was with ADB, which is even easier.
That's right.
And then they don't, I'm not even sure that they have to document that as a derivative transaction with ADB. It's simply an option to convert the loan. So the sovereign is never a party to the derivative until we do a derivative transaction for them on a standalone basis.
Thank you for your wonderful presentations. I am from Ministry of Finance, Korea, and it seems like you are all focusing about the bright side of the derivatives. But, can you please share your thoughts or experiences when there are growing or expanding vulnerabilities in the market because of the derivatives? If there is, there are changes because of the derivatives, is there anything the government can do in a short or long term?
For the crisis, and regulation was not tight enough. So all the initiatives to move towards trade reporting through trade repositories and all the central clearing of derivatives, this has all been a very compact approach to tightening regulation to avoid concentration of risk in individual counterparties. It's to bring transparency, reconciliation, and as I mentioned before, an audit trail in the worst possible scenario where there is a bankruptcy of a major financial institution. The regulators can actually go into the trade repository and track every transaction. This is exactly what they couldn't do with Lehman Brothers during the crisis. But now with that, actually there's too much data. I talked about unique transaction identifiers, UTIs, which happens on every single trade. There's 67 fields of data on every single UTI. Banks are struggling actually with this kind of reporting, but from a regulatory perspective, this helps to prevent repeats.
As to how much data there are, something like 1 billion pieces of data go out every week under MiFID II. So, in fact, there is information overload, as you suggest. So, yeah, there's a lot of information. The working groups looking at unique transaction identifiers, ISINs, and so on. LEIs, legal entity identifiers. So, if there is one entity in which derivatives trades are concentrated, the regulators will be able to figure that out very soon. As of July 3rd, no LEI, no trade. So everyone needs a legal entity identifier, effectively.
I just want to add that in Georgian experience, National Bank of Georgia has the authority to issue regulations and demand from any party other than those parties who are not subject of our regulation to receive information or to demand from them to report any transaction derivatives they will make. So it's like sort of surveillance on the market. So we always have the pulse of the market, how things are developed, what are the volumes, and you always closely observe how things are working. But at the initial stage, since the development of the market is main objective, we don't want to kill market from the beginning with lots of requirements. So that would be an initial stage, but these instruments are in place.
I think I'll close it with this question with more of a kind of a general advice, and that is be careful of a Warren Buffett type statement. While he made the statement, he uses derivatives, and a lot of times the reality is much more simple than it maybe appears to be. So you heard a lot about unique identifier and ID and whatnot. Basically what happened is the derivatives market, especially credit derivatives, expanded so quickly and were backed off. Nobody knew where they were pooling, where the risk was pooling. And when Tim Geithner came in to head the New York Fed, his publicly stated job one was sorting this out. So we knew that this was happening, and he knew he had to get a hold of the back room and figure out where things were going. Unfortunately, he was overtaken by events, and all that risk ended up at AIG, or most of it. So the idea of these unique identifiers and where this stuff is going, that's what arose out of that. But when you go back to the financial crisis itself that originated in the US, it's kind of pegged at the mortgage market, although I think that's an oversimplification. And that simply came about because of fraud. I mean, simply put, fraud. And so people put credit enhancements on products that were fraudulently created. And so all of our understandings of how things worked in the past broke down because we thought they were better quality individual mortgages than they actually were. So, you know, careful of sweeping statements, I think. I'll maybe leave you with, I spent a lot of time trying to get a repo market started in a lot of countries, and I have to overcome a lot of kind of negative connotation, and some of that is because of the tri-party repo market, quote unquote, broke down at the height of the crisis. But I read the New York Fed's postmortem of that so-called breakdown, and it was really embarrassingly simple. The tri-party repo market started many years ago when anybody ever did was an overnight. Then somebody decided we should do 3, 5, 10-day repo. And that was a good idea. So they did it, but the way they did it is you agreed to a 10-day, but all the infrastructure was based on the 1 day. So other than the first day, the day 2 through 9, you showed up in the morning and you got remarried to somebody else just to keep your transaction going. It never occurred to them to just do a 10-day repo. And so they were surprised when people came to realize that this is the way it was working. They all wanted to break their trades, and the people who needed money couldn't get money. So it was a very simple operational flaw, embarrassingly so, actually. So anyway, be careful of, there's always an underlying story, and in my 30 years of experience, it's always simpler than you think.
So that ends our session 8A. Let us join me in thanking the members of our panel with a round of applause.